"Get this grease monkey out of my gala," that's what Cynthia Banks said. Into a live microphone, charcoal blazer, platinum pen catching chandelier light, pointing at the black man who just walked through the main entrance. "Sir, this is invitation only," I know Joshua Bennett said. He walked to the prototype platform. Security grabbed his shoulder. The grip tightened. He didn't stop. He pressed his right thumb to a matte panel on the Helion's engine block. 1 second, 2. The prototype started. Every investor in the ballroom turned. The engine ran, full and clean and exact, and nobody in the room could explain why. Cynthia Banks stood at the microphone and...
Wrong move. Cynthia assumed a sarcastic contract with a grease-stained mechanic was meaningless. Let's get into it.
Billionaire CEO Cynthia Banks thought it was a hilarious joke. She offered her hand in a corporate marriage to a grease-stained black mechanic if he could fix her broken $10 million prototype. She wanted to humiliate him in front of her wealthy investors. She wanted to prove that working-class hands were only meant to serve. But she didn't know the quiet man in the overalls, Joshua Bennett, wasn't just a local mechanic. He was the master aerospace engineer who originally invented her stolen engine design. While she laughed for the cameras, Joshua was quietly rearming the digital locks he had built into the machine years ago. Her arrogant little joke wasn't just an insult. It was a legally binding death warrant about to cost her every penny of her empire. The engine died at 11:43 in the morning. It didn't sputter. It didn't groan. It simply stopped with a sound like a door slamming shut on something expensive, final, and irreversible. The acrid smell hit first. Burning coolant, sharp chemical, and sour. It curled up through the hood vents of the prototype and spread across the cracked asphalt like a slow, ugly stain. The sun was already brutal. By noon, the forecourt of Bennett Auto would be a griddle. It already felt like one. Joshua was under a '98 Silverado when the motorcade pulled in. 3 black SUVs, polished, silent, and perfectly aligned, rolling to a stop on the sun-bleached lot with the practiced precision of people accustomed to arriving somewhere and having it matter. He heard the doors open. He heard heels on asphalt. He did not come out. He finished torquing the lower suspension bolt. He set the wrench down heavy and oil-dark, its grip worn smooth at the center where his palm always landed. He rolled out from under the truck. He stood. Cynthia Banks was already looking past him. She was in white, a silk blazer, pristine, tailored, and utterly untouchable in a way that made the forecourt feel even dirtier by contrast. A platinum fountain pen caught the sun at her breast pocket, cold and deliberate as a badge. Her entourage fanned out behind her 4 suits and 1 junior assistant who clutched a clipboard with both hands and kept her eyes on the ground. Cynthia's gaze swept the garage, the oil drums stacked along the fence, the hand-painted sign above the bay doors, the truck, and finally, reluctantly, Joshua. Her expression did not change. That was the tell. A person who saw nothing worth acknowledging didn't bother to hide it. "You fix cars," she said. It was not a question. Joshua looked at the prototype, still steaming faintly at the hood seam. A Helion Series 5. Clean lines. Matte black casing over a body no production line had ever touched. He recognized the architecture before he recognized the badge. He had always recognized the architecture. "I fix engines," he said. Behind Cynthia, one of the suits let out a short, amused breath. Not a laugh. A punctuation mark. She pulled out her phone. She made a call in the time it took Joshua to wipe his hands. 2 sentences in a language of numbers and names he wasn't meant to follow. She put the phone away. She looked at the prototype. She looked at him. The smile she produced was new, calibrated, and landed somewhere between gracious and surgical. "Well," she said, "since we're here." She gestured loose and unhurried at the broken machine. "My team says the diagnostic alone takes 6 hours at a certified facility, but perhaps a local perspective could be illuminating." "Illuminating," one of the suits repeated. A few of them smiled. Quietly, cooperatively, in the manner of people who understood their function. Joshua walked to the prototype. He crouched at the driver's side. He looked at the panel seam. He did not ask for the hood release because he already knew where it was. He pressed a point just below the Helion badge, a spot unmarked, unreferenced in any public-facing manual, and the hood lifted. The smell intensified. Burned coolant and something else beneath it, something mechanical and specific that Joshua placed in under 2 seconds. He straightened. He did not speak immediately. 3 hours, he said. Cynthia looked at him for a moment, the smile still in place, adjusted. I'm sorry. The diagnostic, 3 hours, not 6. Silence stretched across the forecourt. The junior assistant, the one with the clipboard, glanced up for the first time. Her eyes were quick, careful, and missed nothing. She looked at Joshua's hands. She looked at the hood. She looked down again. Cynthia let the silence sit for one breath longer than necessary. Then she turned to her entourage with the easy familiarity of someone passing a private joke. Local perspective, she said, and the suit smiled again, obliging and frictionless. Fix it, Cynthia said, turning back to him. Her voice was pleasant, even warm, in the way a closing argument is warm before it lands. Fix it, and I'll give you something extraordinary. A corporate marriage. She spread both hands, a gesture of theatrical generosity. 50% of Banks Automotive. In writing. Right now. She looked at the junior assistant. Give me something to write on. The assistant, Amanda Pierce, her name badge barely readable under the glare, unclipped a diner receipt from the back of her board. Cynthia took it without looking at her. She uncapped the platinum pen. She wrote slowly and clearly in the unmistakable hand of someone who signed things for spectacle. The suits watched. One of them pulled out a phone. The camera was already recording. Cynthia signed her name and held the napkin up 2 fingers easy like it was a cocktail menu. The entourage laughed. Joshua looked at the napkin. He looked at her name written on it, sharp, looping, and real. He looked at her. Okay, he said. The laugh stuttered. Cynthia's smile held, but something behind it recalibrated, something small and involuntary that her face was too practiced to fully conceal. She set the napkin on the hood of the prototype signature facing up. Don't hurt yourself, she said, and walked toward the shade of the far fence with her entourage. Amanda placed the clipboard on the hood beside the napkin. Her fingers stayed on it a moment too long. She was looking at the engine. Her eyes tracked the seam where Joshua had pressed to release the hood, the unmarked point, the one that wasn't in any manual. Her expression was careful reading, filing. She put the clipboard down. She stepped back. She said nothing. Joshua leaned into the engine bay. The Helion internals were exactly as he expected them to be, because he had drawn them. Not the current iteration, not the production revision, but the foundation. The original load-bearing logic beneath every refinement Cynthia's engineers had applied. The bones were his. He could feel it the way you feel a room you grew up in, not by reading it, but by moving through it without thinking. He worked with the oil-stained wrench, steady, quiet, and methodical, not performing for the camera phone still running at the edge of the group. He moved to the far side of the block. His fingers found a plate recessed. Matte finish barely distinguishable from the surrounding casing unless you knew its dimensions. A biometric sensor dormant still embedded in the original chassis. His thumb passed over its surface in a motion that looked like cleaning. It was not cleaning. The sun pressed down on the lot. The smell of Cynthia's perfume, expensive and floral and aggressively present, mixed with the cooling burn of the engine and settled into the air like an argument. Sweat gathered at the back of Joshua's collar. He didn't stop. Behind him from the shade, Cynthia's voice carried across the lot in bright, caring fragments. Family business, she said. She paused. Charming. Another laugh from the suits, polished and reflexive. Amanda didn't laugh. She watched Joshua work. Her clipboard was pressed flat against her chest, now both arms crossed over it, and her eyes were steady, unreadable recording in the way that quiet people record things when they have learned that speaking is costly. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, Joshua stood. He closed the hood. He picked up the wrench. "Done," he said. Cynthia turned from the fence. She looked at him, then at the prototype, then at the digital panel where a steady green readout pulsed clean and solid where red failure codes had burned an hour ago. She walked over. She opened the driver's door. She started the engine. It turned over full and smooth the way a $10 million prototype was designed to sound powerful, seamless, and completely silent in every way it wasn't supposed to be loud. She let it run for a moment. She turned it off. "Impressive," she said, and the word was a door closing. She picked up the napkin from the hood. She folded it once. She dropped it back onto the forecourt signature side up where the asphalt heat would curl the edges. She looked at Joshua with the same expression she had worn when she arrived, pleasant, distant, and resolutely unseeing. "Send us an invoice," she said. "We'll process it through procurement, standard 30 days. She walked back to the first SUV. The suits followed smooth and synchronized. Amanda was last. She stopped at the prototype's rear panel. Her eyes dropped to the folded napkin on the asphalt, then lifted to Joshua, and in that fraction of a second, something passed between them, wordless, waited, and exactly the shape of a question she did not ask. She walked on. She got in the car. The motorcade left the same way it arrived, quiet, aligned, unhurried. Joshua stood on the hot asphalt of his father's garage lot and watched the SUVs disappear. The wrench rested in his palm, heavy, familiar, and oil dark. He crouched. He picked up the napkin. The ink was clean, bold, and binding. He read her name once. He folded it again, small, careful, and deliberate. He put it in his chest pocket. He didn't know what Cynthia Banks thought the afternoon had cost her. He did know what she hadn't understood when she laughed, what she hadn't considered when she held the napkin up for the cameras, and what she certainly hadn't accounted for when she drove away in the machine. His hands had just restored, and his original mind had never stopped owning. But Cynthia didn't know that signing her name in mockery was the first stroke of signing away her empire. The garage was dark by the time Joshua finished. Not the comfortable dark of a closed shop, but the particular dark of a place still running, still breathing, with a single fluorescent tube buzzing above the hydraulic lift in a faint, irregular rhythm that had been wrong for 3 years. He had meant to replace it. He had meant to do a great many things that money kept making impossible. He had worked through the night. The Helion prototype sat on the lift, now elevated, exposed, and gleaming in the thin light. The engine block was repaired, sealed, and calibrated to tolerances that Banks Automotive's own engineers had not achieved in 2 production cycles. Joshua knew this because he had read their public diagnostic reports. He knew the gap. He had always known the gap because the gap was the distance between what he had originally designed and what they had managed to copy. He wiped the chrome housing with a clean rag. The repaired surface caught the fluorescent flicker and returned it steady, flawless, and composed. He set the rag down. He looked at the engine for a moment, the way a person looks at something they understand completely, which is to say, without surprise. By 7 in the morning, the motorcade was back. The SUVs arrived in the same formation, silent, precise, and deliberate, but this time the doors opened wider. There were more of them, 6 suits instead of 4. 2 men Joshua didn't recognize who carried the particular stillness of people paid to evaluate things. And behind them, Cynthia Banks in a second white blazer identical to the first, pristine, untouched, and aggressively clean in a way that felt like a statement directed at the garage itself. Amanda Pierce came last. She had the clipboard. She had the same careful eyes. She looked at the lift before she looked at anything else. Cynthia walked the perimeter of the prototype without speaking. She circled it once, twice her heels precise on the oil-stained concrete, the platinum pen turning slowly between 2 fingers. She stopped at the engine bay. She looked at the block. She looked at the readout panel, green and steady, and then she looked at Joshua with an expression that was almost but not quite something genuine. "Well," she said. She turned to the two quiet men and spoke in the low, conclusive register of someone delivering a verdict. Joshua caught 3 words: functional, timeline, viable. The men exchanged a look. One of them nodded. Cynthia turned back to the garage, and for the first time she looked at it properly. The hand-painted sign, the stacked drums, the battered tool wall with its missing pegs, the single buzzing tube casting everything in its uneven yellow wash. She let her gaze move across all of it with the slow, curatorial attention of a person walking through an exhibit about poverty. She tilted her head. "You built all this yourself," she said. "My father did," Joshua said. "I kept it running." She nodded once, the nod of someone receiving information that confirmed what they already suspected. She moved toward the prototype's front panel, reaching into the engine bay with 2 fingers touching the housing in a way that was purely performative. She had no idea what she was touching. The gesture was for the quiet men. It said, "I understand this machine." It said, "This space and everything in it is legible to me." It said everything she needed it to say without being accurate about any of it. "Remarkable," she said to no one specific. She withdrew her hand. She smiled at Joshua with the warm, level warmth of someone bestowing recognition. "We have a few colleagues who'd love to hear the story, how a local shop, a one-man operation." She paused, turning to the suits with the ease of a conductor cueing an orchestra. "Fixed what our certified facility couldn't." The suits smiled. One of them laughed short appreciative and placed exactly where it needed to be. Joshua said nothing. Cynthia gestured toward the prototype, sweeping and proprietary. "Would you walk us through the repair for their benefit?" He walked them through it. He used the correct vocabulary, measured precise, and stripped of any register that would invite the kind of attention that required explanation. He described the coolant system failure, the cascade damage to the thermal regulation, housing the recalibration sequence. He named the parts. He named the tolerances. He did not name the original source of the architecture he was describing because no one in the room asked, and because some information was not a gift. Amanda was writing. She wrote quickly with the focused compression of someone who had learned to transcribe accurately in rooms where she was expected to be invisible. Her pen moved in small, tight strokes. At one point, Joshua named a specific torque value, a figure precise enough to be unusual, and she stopped writing for exactly 1 second before continuing. She had caught something. He knew because her eyes came up just briefly to the engine block, to the same area he had described. She was, Joshua had noted from the previous afternoon, not invisible at all. She simply operated in the space between what people were watching and what they were not. He finished the walkthrough. The quiet men exchanged another look. Cynthia nodded with the gravity of someone issuing approval. "Extraordinary," she said. She did not mention the invoice. She did not mention the napkin. She moved toward the prototype's driver's side with the easy ownership of someone returning to what was already theirs. And she opened the door and she turned the engine over. It ran the way it had run the night before. Perfect, complete, built on a foundation she had not laid. She got out. She handed the key to one of the suits, and the suit handed it to the other. And the prototype was walked out of the garage bay with the brisk, unceremonious efficiency of something being reclaimed. Joshua stood at the mouth of the bay. He watched the Helion roll out onto the forecourt into the morning light and away. The chrome block caught the sun for 1 second, brilliant clear, and already gone. Behind him, the fluorescent tube buzzed. The hydraulic lift stood empty. He looked at the workbench, at the stack of papers, at the corner utility statements, and a parts invoice printed creased and unpaid. He could feel its folded edge when he breathed. He reached over to the console panel on the workbench, the secondary diagnostic unit patched into the Helion's onboard computer during the repair. He entered 8 digits. He confirmed. The console accepted the sequence with a single quiet green pulse. He closed the panel. Amanda's clipboard was gone. But Amanda Pierce Joshua knew had written down the torque figure. She had written down the part designation sequence. She had looked up at the engine block at exactly the moment that mattered. What exact protocol Joshua had quietly programmed into that engine's onboard computer before the Helion left the bay was a question nobody in Cynthia's entourage thought to ask. They thought treating him like a joke would break his pride, completely unaware he had just planted the detonator. The press conference was held at Banks Automotive's downtown headquarters 48 hours after the prototype left Joshua's forecourt. He watched it on his phone. Propped against a can of brake fluid on the workbench, the screen small and bright in the dim garage. Cynthia took the stage at 2 in the afternoon. She was in white again, a third blazer sharper at the shoulders than the previous two, with the platinum pin at the breast pocket, catching the blinding, relentless flash of press cameras the way a lighthouse catches weather. The grand hall behind her was marble and glass, all clean lines and reflected light. The kind of architecture that existed to make whatever happened inside it feel inevitable. The microphone stand was cold, heavy steel, and she gripped it with both hands, victorious, centered, and fully arrived. 18 months of development, she said. She paused, turning to let the cameras catch her profile. 18 months of the most rigorous, the most demanding, and the most innovative engineering work this company has ever undertaken, the reporters wrote. The cameras flashed. The room moved with the particular synchrony of an audience that had already decided to believe. Joshua set down the wrench he was holding. He watched the screen. The Helion Series 5, Cynthia continued, represents a complete rethinking of thermal load architecture and high-performance engine systems. It is not an iteration. It is not a refinement. She looked directly into the front camera, steady and declarative. It is a reinvention conceived, developed, and delivered by the engineers of Banks Automotive. Silence in the hall, then applause, organized and immediate. On the workbench, Joshua's phone cast its small light against the wall. The stack of papers beside it had not moved since the previous day. Utility invoice on top, red bordered, patient and exact. Beneath it, a parts receipt for components he had used on the Helion repair components he had pulled from his own inventory, his own cost absorbed without discussion. His actual invoice, the $5,000 diagnostic and repair fee, had been submitted to Banks Automotive's procurement system at 7 the previous morning. He had received an automated acknowledgement. He had received nothing else. Back on the screen, a reporter's hand went up. Ms. Banks, there are independent engineers who've noted certain similarities between the Helion's thermal architecture and a 2019 aerospace patent filed under a private holding company. Can you respond to that? Cynthia's expression did not flicker. She turned toward the question with the relaxed precision of someone who had prepared for exactly this in a mirror. Innovation rarely happens in a vacuum, she said pleasantly. The Helion was developed through a rigorous internal process. Our IP documentation is complete, audited, and legally sound. She tilted her head, gracious and conclusive. We welcome scrutiny. That's what confidence looks like. More applause. The reporter sat down. Joshua picked up his phone. He watched Cynthia step back from the microphone, the hall still moving with light and sound around her, and accept a glass of water from an assistant who was not Amanda. He turned the screen off. He stood in the garage for a moment. The buzzing tube above the lift filled the silence with its thin electric persistence. Outside, the sun had moved past the peak of the forecourt and was cutting low and sharp across the asphalt, the heat bending the air above the blacktop in slow, visible waves. 53 hours since the motorcade had first pulled in. 2 days of nothing, returning the call. He walked to the garage door. He looked out at the lot. A car he didn't recognize was parked at the edge of the forecourt, a sedan. Dark blue engine off. It had been there for 20 minutes. The driver's window was lowered 2 inches, not watching or not appearing to watch, which was its own kind of watching. He went back inside. At 3:47 in the afternoon, a figure appeared at the bay entrance. Amanda Pierce. No clipboard this time, no entourage behind her. She was in the same clothes she had worn to the press conference. Joshua could see the lanyard still around her neck. But her jacket was off, and she was carrying nothing except a sealed envelope. She stopped at the threshold of the bay like someone observing a boundary she hadn't decided yet to cross. "Ms. Banks wanted me to deliver this personally," she said. Joshua wiped his hands on the rag and walked over. He took the envelope. He opened it. Inside was a single crisp bill, folded once. $100. No note, no reference number, no acknowledgement of the $5,000 invoice. Just the bill, clean, deliberate, and precisely the dimension of an insult calibrated by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. He held it for a moment. He looked at it. Amanda's eyes were on the workbench behind him, on the papers, on the red-bordered utility statement at the top of the stack. Her jaw was set tight and still, and she was not looking at the $100 bill in his hand. She was very carefully looking somewhere else. Joshua set the bill down on the workbench. He set it flat, face up, parallel to the edge, exact and deliberate and unhurried. He looked at Amanda. "Thank you," he said. She met his eyes then, and whatever she had been holding carefully behind her expression moved through it briefly, controlled and undeniable. Disgust, he thought. Shame. The species of emotion that belongs to a person watching something wrong happen in a room they cannot leave. She left without saying anything else. Joshua stood at the workbench in the cooling afternoon. The $100 bill lay flat against the wood. He did not touch it again. He pulled his phone out and opened the browser, navigating to the Banks Automotive investor page where the stock had moved up 4 points since the press conference. Cynthia's photograph sat at the top of the page, poised sharp and confident, the platinum pen visible at her pocket. He set the phone face down. He picked up the wrench, heavy and oil-dark and worn smooth where it always met his hand, and he went back to work. Cynthia smiled for the cameras, believing she had secured her legacy, having no idea she was simply driving a stolen bomb.
Wait, absolutely not. Cynthia stealing a working-class man's labor and parading it on national television as her own genius is pure evil. If that were me, I would have dragged her off that podium myself. Imagine sitting in a dusty garage, watching the person who ruined you take all the credit, while the whole world applauds them. The audacity is real.
They came on a Thursday morning before the heat settled in. 3 of them suits, dark briefcases, polished and moving with the particular efficiency of people who billed by the hour and intended to be elsewhere by noon. They arrived in a single car, not the black SUV motorcade of Cynthia's visits, but a silver sedan, understated and corporate, parked with clean precision at the edge of the forecourt. They crossed the lot without looking at the garage. They were looking at the property line. Joshua was replacing brake pads on a customer's Civic when he heard the footsteps on the asphalt. He didn't come out immediately. He finished seating the caliper. He set the wrench down. He rolled out from under the car and stood. The lead attorney was already at the bay entrance, a man in his 40s, composed and unhurried, with the kind of face that had delivered bad news so many times it had simply become a neutral surface. He held a document folder, thick bound and sealed. His 2 colleagues stood slightly behind him, one checking his phone, one looking at the hand-painted sign above the bay doors with an expression of mild professional appraisal. "Joshua Bennett," the lead attorney said. "Yes," Joshua said. The man opened the folder. He produced a document, thick, crisp, and printed on paper, heavy enough to feel final in the hand, and held it out with the practiced extension of someone who knew the weight of what they were passing. Joshua took it. The harsh, glaring red ink of the condemned stamp bled through the top page like a wound, vivid and exact, positioned where it would be seen first and processed last. He read, Banks Automotive had filed a compulsory acquisition notice under a commercial development statute, a provision applied to properties adjacent to designated growth corridors. The garage lot, the forecourt, the storage structure at the rear, and the access easement along the east fence line All of it had been formally designated as a future facility site. The demolition order was attached on page 4. The bulldozers were scheduled for 5:30 the following morning. Joshua turned to page 4. He read the demolition order. He turned back to page 1. He read the acquisition clause. The lead attorney waited with the patient stillness of a man who had given people time to read documents before and understood the shape of what came after. This property has been in continuous commercial operation for 31 years, Joshua said. That's noted in the assessment, the attorney said. His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a person who had separated himself from the content of his work so completely and so long ago that the separation was no longer an effort, but a condition. There's a compensation figure on page 7. Ms. Banks's office considers it fair market value. Joshua turned to page 7. The figure was precise, calculated, and approximately 40% of what the lot was worth. It was also, he noted, slightly less than the outstanding balance on the utility arrears that had accumulated over the past 18 months while Banks Automotive's procurement system processed nothing. He closed the document. Behind him inside the garage, his father's tools hung on the wall in the order they had always hung, heavy, grease-dark, and organized by the particular logic of a man who had spent 30 years knowing exactly where everything was in the dark. The hydraulic lift stood at rest. The fluorescent tube buzzed. A customer's Civic sat half-serviced on the bay floor. The suffocating dry heat of the afternoon was already building through the open bay doors. From somewhere outside, from a neighboring lot or a passing vehicle, came the sharp, sickening rip of packing tape being pulled from a roll loud and clean in the still air, and then silence again. The second attorney had moved along the forecourt perimeter. He was taking photographs with his phone, methodical, systematic, and working from the east fence inward. The third was consulting a document of his own, comparing something to the property layout, marking notes in a margin. "You have until 8 this morning to vacate personal property," the lead attorney said. "Anything remaining on site at the time of demolition becomes the responsibility of the acquisition team." Joshua looked at him. "My father built this garage," Joshua said. The statement was flat, informational, and entirely without appeal. He was not asking the attorney to feel anything about it. He was placing it in the record of the moment, which was its own kind of documentation. The attorney nodded. He took the document back when Joshua held it out, closed the folder, and clicked the briefcase shut with the heavy, polished sound of something being finalized. He produced a business card and set it on the hood of the nearest vehicle. "If you have legal representation," he said, "have them contact the office listed. Ms. Banks is open to discussing timeline within reason." He turned. He walked back across the forecourt toward the silver sedan. His colleagues followed. The photograph taker finishing his last frame before pivoting the notemaker, folding his document with practiced neatness. The briefcases snapped shut in sequence, 2 quick clicks, sharp and identical, echoing off the garage front. They laughed as they crossed the lot, not loudly, not cruelly, but in the easy way of people who had concluded their business and returned to themselves. One of them said something Joshua couldn't hear. Another responded. The third opened the car door. Then Amanda Pierce stepped out of the sedan's rear door. She had been in the car the entire time. Joshua understood this now. The reason she had not been visible when the lawyers crossed the lot, the reason no one had introduced her or accounted for her. She carried nothing. She walked directly to Joshua and stopped 3 feet in front of him, and she was looking at him with the steady, shame-filled eyes of a person completing a task they had not chosen. She held out a second copy of the eviction notice, her own copy. Required, he understood, as personal delivery confirmation. He took it. She did not move immediately. She stood on the forecourt in the building heat with the document now transferred, and her hands empty and her eyes on a point just past his left shoulder, unable or unwilling to meet his calm, unwavering gaze. Then she turned. She got back in the car. The door closed. The silver sedan left the lot in the direction the motorcade always left, smooth, aligned, and certain. Joshua stood in the forecourt holding the second copy of the notice. The red stamp bled through from the front page. He could feel it through the paper, the weight of the ink, official, indelible, and real. The lawyers laughed as they walked away, failing to realize that cornering a master strategist is the deadliest mistake you can make. If you want to see how this arrogant CEO loses every penny of her stolen empire, you know what to do. Now back to Joshua's darkest hour. The garage was cold by 10 at night. Not the dry, manageable cold of an autumn evening, but the specific cold of an unheated concrete structure bleeding warmth into the dark, slow, and total, the kind that settled into the joints and stayed. Joshua had not turned the space heater on. He was not sure at this particular hour that it mattered enough to bother. He was packing his father's tools. Not all of them, not yet. He had started with the smaller ones, the socket set. The torque wrenches, the calibration tools in their foam-lined cases, items that required care in transit, items that could not be replaced at any price that currently made sense to consider. He packed them into a cardboard box, flimsy brown and creased from a previous use, the kind of box that had no business holding anything irreplaceable. He knew this. He packed them anyway because the box was what he had, and the bulldozers were scheduled for 5:30 in the morning, and the hour was already past 10, and some arithmetic was simply beyond negotiating. In the corner of the bay, on the small rolling cart that served as a secondary workstation, a television played. His father's television, a 14-inch set with a cracked lower bezel and a volume knob that required a specific lateral pressure to move, broadcasting the Banks Automotive Launch Gala from a grand ballroom somewhere in the city. The screen was pale blue, flickering faintly, casting its cold light across the concrete floor in a thin, trembling rectangle. Cynthia Banks was at the podium. She was in a new suit, ivory this time, rather than white, with a different cut at the collar that suggested the occasion required a distinct register of pristine. Crystal champagne flutes caught the ballroom light behind her, dozens of them, arrayed on white-clothed tables occupied by investors, board members, and the quiet men Joshua had seen in his garage 2 weeks prior. The chandeliers were enormous. Everything in the frame was enormous, deliberately architecturally enormous. Built to make whoever stood inside it feel that they belonged to something larger than themselves. The Helion Series 5. Cynthia said, her voice carrying the particular resonance of a room designed for resonance, is the future of this company. And this company, she paused, lifting her glass, is the future. Applause, extended, warm, and real. Joshua wrapped his father's favorite wrench in a shop rag. It was a heavy, rusted iron piece, older than the garage sign, older than the hydraulic lift, worn at the head from decades of use that predated Joshua's hands by 30 years. He had watched his father use this wrench on engines that no longer existed, on vehicles that were now crushed and recycled, on problems that had seemed enormous and had been solved. He held it for a moment longer than the packing required. He set it in the box. The television applauded. He did not look at it. For the first time since the motorcade had first pulled onto his forecourt, the darkness in the garage felt absolute, not dramatic, not cinematic, but factual, the way a loss is factual when the paperwork is signed and the hour is late and the box in front of you is real and cardboard and already half full. He was a working-class mechanic in a cold garage on the night before demolition, and across the city, in a ballroom full of crystal and certainty, a woman was accepting applause for his life's work. His mind, the part of it that had always run parallel calculations without being asked, presented the arithmetic clearly, methodically, and without mercy. She had the patents. Forged, yes, inadequately documented, yes, but held, filed, and defended by a legal architecture he could not match with the contents of a cardboard box and a diner napkin. She had the investors, she had the narrative, she had the press, she had the prototype running perfectly restored by his hands locked to his biometric sequence. But physically in her possession in a ballroom he had not been invited to attend. Had he miscalculated? The question arrived without drama and sat without moving. He considered it honestly, the way he considered all mechanical problems, without sentiment, without the comfort of a preferred answer. The biometric lock was real. The napkin was real. The contract language written in her hand, signed by her name, witnessed by a phone camera recording for her own entourage, was real. But real and actionable were not the same thing. A billionaire's legal team did not need to win. They needed only to delay, and delay cost money. And money was the one variable in every calculation that currently resolved to almost nothing. Was the system simply too rigged to ever beat? The question stayed. On the television, the applause continued. Someone was handing Cynthia a commemorative plaque, crystal-mounted, heavy, and engraved. She accepted it with the ease of a person accustomed to receiving things. Her smile was bright, practiced, and completely comfortable in the light. Joshua sat on the stool beside the workbench. The cardboard box was in front of him, half packed open at the top. The tools inside it were his father's tools, and the tools of 31 years of a business that had fixed things for people who needed things fixed quietly, correctly, and without recognition. He looked at the box for a long time. His hand moved to his chest pocket. Not intentionally, the way a hand moves toward a familiar weight without instruction. His fingers found the folded edge of the diner napkin, still there, the paper soft now from days of warmth, the fold lines deep and permanent. He didn't take it out. He felt the indented pressure of her signature through the layers, those bold, looping letters written fast and dismissively by a woman who had not imagined for 1 second that she was writing anything that would outlast the moment. Her name pressed into cheap paper, still there, still exact. He sat with it for a moment that had no particular length. Then he looked at the cardboard box for the last time. Slowly, he pushed it aside. He reached for his jacket on the hook by the bay door, heavy canvas, oil-faded at the cuffs. He put it on. He stood. He stared at the cardboard box for a long time, and then slowly he pushed it aside and grabbed his jacket. The ballroom was still loud when Joshua walked in. Not the entrance the security team expected. Not a delivery door or a service corridor, but the main entrance, the one with the crystal-paneled doors, and the attendant in a fitted jacket who reached out one hand and said, "Sir, this event is invitation only," and to whom Joshua said quietly and without breaking stride, "I know," and kept walking. The attendant followed for 3 steps. He stopped. Something in the quality of Joshua's pace, measured, deliberate, and completely without urgency, produced in the attendant a specific uncertainty that was more paralyzing than confrontation would have been. He stood at the threshold and watched Joshua cross the ballroom floor. The room was everything the television had shown, and larger. The chandeliers were refracted light, enormous, cascading and casting the crowd in a warm gold that made everything below them look chosen. The prototype sat on a raised platform at the room's center, the Helion Series 5 black-cased and flawless under its own dedicated lighting. The centerpiece of an evening built entirely around the idea that it had been made here by these people in this room's image. Tables ringed the platform. Investors, board members, the quiet men. Crystal flutes everywhere, half full and comfortable. Cynthia was at the platform's edge, speaking to a group of 3, her back to the main entrance. She did not see Joshua until he was 12 feet away. She turned. She looked at him. Her expression completed its movement from recognition to confusion to controlled displeasure in under 2 seconds. And the controlled displeasure was very good practiced and seamless, but it was not fast enough. "Mr. Bennett," she said. The name landed with a particular weight, the weight of a person using a name to establish a perimeter. "This is a private event." "I know," Joshua said. He stopped at the base of the platform. He looked at the prototype. He looked at her. "I need to show you something." She turned to the nearest member of her security detail with the small economical gesture of a person who had resolved situations this way before. The security member moved. Joshua did not move. He stood at the platform's base, still straight, and wearing a suit that did not belong to the garage, did not belong to the forecourt, did not belong to any version of him Cynthia Banks had constructed and filed away. It was dark, precisely fitted, and quiet in the way that certain things are quiet when they no longer need to announce themselves. The security member reached Joshua's shoulder. He stopped there. He had encountered the same quality the door attendant had encountered, the specific gravitational stillness of a person who had already calculated every response to every possible next event and found none of them concerning. "Ms. Banks," Joshua said without looking at the security member, "start the prototype." Something moved through the room. Not sound, not movement. A change in atmospheric pressure, the kind that precedes a shift in weather. The three investors Cynthia had been speaking with had not moved. They were watching. Cynthia looked at Joshua for a moment, the controlled displeasure holding, and then she turned to the platform and gave a single nod to the technician stationed at the ignition console. The technician entered the sequence. The console accepted the input. The prototype did not start. The technician entered the sequence again. The console read the command. The engine was silent. Dead silence hit the ballroom. Not the silence of a pause, but the silence of a system failing in a room where failure had not been scheduled. It arrived suddenly, breathlessly, and sucked the ambient warmth out of the space in one clean pull. Somewhere near the back tables, a crystal flute was set down. The small sound carried. Cynthia looked at the console. She looked at the technician. She looked at Joshua. He reached into his jacket's interior pocket. He produced two items. The first was the diner napkin, unfolded, now flat and clear, the signature bold and legible even from the distance of the nearest investor's table. He set it on the platform's edge without ceremony. The second was a single printed document, 2 pages crisp and bearing at its upper left corner a patent registration number and a filing date of March 14th, 2019. "The Helion's thermal load architecture," Joshua said. His voice was even measured and fully controlled, the voice of a person explaining something technical in a setting where technical accuracy was the only thing that mattered. "Is protected under aerospace patent number 109473882, originally filed under the holding company Bennett Aero Solutions. That's my company." He paused, not for effect, for accuracy. "The engine won't run without a biometric authorization sequence coded to my fingerprint. I built that into the original design. Your engineers copied the architecture. They didn't copy that." He pressed his right thumb to the biometric sensor plate on the engine block's left side, the recessed matte panel that looked like casing to anyone who hadn't designed it, that had looked like casing to Cynthia when she stood in his garage and reached into the engine bay to perform understanding for her investors. 1 second. 2. The Helion started. Full and smooth and exactly as powerful as $10 million and one master aerospace engineer's original mind had designed it to be. Cynthia did not move. The color in her face had changed in a way that the ballroom's warm gold lighting could not entirely conceal. The slick, cold sweat breaking across her forehead caught the chandelier light once briefly, and her hands, the hands that had held the platinum pen and signed the napkin and waved the $100 bill and accepted the crystal plaque, were entirely still at her sides. Brandon Lee materialized at the edge of the platform. He was unhurried. He had the settled, unhurried quality of a man who had been waiting in a specific position for a specific moment and had arrived at it precisely on schedule. He was holding his own copy of the napkin contract, authenticated, countersigned, and dated. He set it beside Joshua's copy. "The contract is legally binding," Brandon said. He looked at Cynthia with the calm, direct expression of a lead venture capitalist whose $500 million was currently reevaluating its loyalties in real time. 50% equity transfer, witnessed, signed, enforceable. Joshua did not shout. He did not raise his voice. He did not alter his register by a single degree. He stood at the platform's edge in the ballroom's enormous light and spoke in a terrifyingly even low tone, calmly explaining patent law to the hyperventilating CEO in the ivory suit, explaining it the way he explained torque tolerances and thermal load sequences, with the precision of a person who understood exactly what he was describing and had understood it for a very long time. At the far edge of the crowd near the third table from the platform's left, Amanda Pierce stood with her clipboard pressed flat against her chest. She was the same assistant who had gripped that clipboard in the forecourt heat, who had watched her boss drop a napkin on cracked asphalt, who had written down the torque figure, who had delivered the eviction notice with shame-filled eyes and empty hands. She stood now in the ballroom's gold light and watched the entire reversal with wide, unblinking eyes. And on her face was an expression that had no name for performance because it was not performing anything. It was simply present, witnessing, awake. Cynthia's arrogant smirk dissolved into sheer panic as she realized the quiet man she had treated as a joke had just legally stolen her entire empire. The arrest happened at 9:17 in the morning, 30 days later. Not in the ballroom, not in the corporate tower, not in any location that Cynthia Banks had designed or chosen or controlled. It happened in the underground parking structure beneath Banks Automotive's headquarters, in the gray, fluorescent light of a level reserved for executive vehicles, as she was walking from her car to the elevator with the platinum pen in her jacket pocket and her phone already open and already mid-sentence to someone who by that hour was no longer returning her calls. 2 federal agents. Plain clothes badges presented voices level and procedural. The cold, undeniable click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists arrived in the gray underground air with a finality that had no drama in it. Only physics, metal closing on metal, the sound of a mechanism completing its intended function. Her voice, when it came, was not the ballroom voice. It was not the forecourt voice, pleasant and calibrated and built for an audience. It was something underneath all of that, urgent, hollow, and entirely unpersuasive, bouncing off the concrete pillars of the parking structure in the way that sound bounces off surfaces that have no interest in it. The federal agents did not alter their pace. The elevator came. The doors opened. The doors closed. The hollow, echoing sound of Cynthia's frantic, unanswered pleas faded into the structure's ambient hum, and then was gone. Above on the 43rd floor, the trading terminals were already running. The stock had begun its drop at market open, accelerating through the morning in the clean, catastrophic geometry of a chart that had lost its narrative. The glowing red lines of plummeting stock figures descended the screen with the indifferent precision of a system correcting for introduced error, erasing in hours what fraud had constructed over months. By 10 in the morning, 3 board members had issued statements. By 11, the lead institutional investor had filed for emergency receivership review. By noon, Brandon Lee was on a call that lasted 40 minutes and ended with a vote. Joshua heard about the vote at 12:40. He was at the garage, not packing, not dismantling. He had returned the customer's Civic 2 days after the gala completed, invoiced, and paid. He had taken 2 new jobs since then, a transmission rebuild and a coolant system overhaul, the ordinary specific work of a business that had not closed because someone had decided it was not going to close. The bulldozers had not come. An emergency injunction filed the morning after the gala by a legal team Brandon had mobilized before the ballroom's chandeliers had finished dimming had seen to that. The condemned notice was currently the subject of 3 separate legal challenges. The red stamp was not, it turned out, as final as the heavy paper it was printed on had suggested. Brandon called at 12:43. "Board vote passed," he said. "Unanimous minus Cynthia, who is currently being processed." A pause. "The tower's yours, Joshua. Executive suite effective immediately. We'd like you up here when you're ready." Joshua set the phone on the workbench. He looked at the garage, the hand-painted sign, the hydraulic lift, the battered tool wall with its missing pegs, the fluorescent tube that still buzzed with the same irregular rhythm it had always buzzed with, faithful and unrepaired and entirely itself. He looked at his father's tools still in the cardboard box beside the bench where he had pushed it aside 3 weeks ago and not unpacked and not moved. He opened the box. He took out the heavy, rusted iron wrench, his father's wrench worn at the head and dark with the accumulated use of 2 lifetimes. He held it for a moment, the familiar weight settling into his palm at exactly the point where the grip had been worn smooth. He put it in his jacket pocket. The corporate tower was 43 floors of glass and climate-controlled certainty, the kind of building that had always existed in a different category of city than the one Bennett Auto occupied. The lobby was marble quiet and staffed by people whose professional function was to make arrivals feel expected. Joshua crossed it without stopping. He took the elevator to the 43rd floor. The executive suite smelled of fresh air and altitude, clean and impersonal, the windows running floor to ceiling along the south wall with the city arranged below them. In its full, intricate entirety, every street and rooftop and distant forecourt visible and small and precise. The mahogany desk sat at the suite's center, enormous, pristine, and bearing on its polished surface the faint rectangular ghost of where Cynthia's nameplate had stood until approximately 2 hours prior. Amanda Pierce was already there. She stood near the window with her clipboard, the same clipboard reliable and present, and she looked at Joshua when he entered with the direct, clear-eyed expression of a person who had been waiting for this specific arrival since a morning on a sun-baked forecourt when she had gripped that clipboard with both hands and chosen very carefully to write everything down. Brandon was there, 3 board members, the quiet men no longer quiet in the same way, animated now with the specific energy of people whose calculation had resolved correctly. Joshua crossed the suite. He stood at the desk. He reached into his jacket pocket. He placed the heavy, oil-stained silver wrench onto the center of Cynthia's former pristine mahogany desk, and it landed with the dense, settled sound of something that belonged exactly where it had been put, not as a symbol requiring explanation, not as a gesture performing meaning, but as an object in its right location after a long and specific journey to get there. No one in the room said anything about it. Brandon extended his hand. Joshua took it. The board members moved toward the conference table. Amanda opened a fresh page on her clipboard and uncapped her pen ready, composed, and finally in a room where it was no longer costly to see, clearly no longer required to look away. Joshua turned to the window. Below the city ran in every direction, ordinary and enormous, full of garages and forecourts and painted signs and tools worn smooth by the hands of people who fixed things. He ran his thumb once across the wrench's dark iron head, feeling the grain of it, the weight the 31 years of accumulated use pressed into the metal like a record. He took a quiet, uninterrupted breath. The wrench on the desk caught the afternoon light through 43 floors of glass, and for just a moment it gleamed heavy, oil dark, and absolutely certain exactly the way it had gleamed on the forecourt, the morning Cynthia Banks made the last mistake she would ever make with both hands free. This story is fiction, but that feeling of pure, unadulterated systemic vindication, that's real, I have to confess. Watching an arrogant corporate bully get legally dismantled by their own paperwork never fails to satisfy. What would you have done if you were standing in that ballroom when the trap sprang? Drop a comment, like, share, subscribe.